called him a gangster, but that word is far too small. Gangsters fight over streets. Gangsters chase money. Gangsters die young. This man built a system. Before him, the mafia was chaos. Petty bosses, bloody vendettas, families destroying each other over pride. After him, crime became organized. His name was Lucky Luciano. He arrived in America as a child who had nothing. No money, no power, no future. Packed into the slums of New York's Lower East Side, he learned early that America didn't offer opportunity equally. So he did something dangerous. He stopped playing by the rules. While others fought over corners, Luciano studied control. He saw why gangs failed, why bosses fell, why violence attracted attention. And he understood a truth that terrified his enemies. Fear creates followers, but structure creates empires. Luciano didn't want fast money. He wanted permanence. He eliminated tradition. He rejected outdated loyalty. He replaced emotion with efficiency. And when the old mafia leadership stood in his way, he erased them, one by one. What rose from the blood wasn't just a new boss. It was a new blueprint. 5 families, a governing commission, rules that ended wars and multiplied profits. For the first time in history, organized crime functioned like a corporation. Even the US government would later turn to him for help during World War II. Think about that. A man born poor, raised by the streets, became so powerful that the state had to negotiate with him. This is not a story about crime alone. It's about power, systems, and what happens when intelligence meets opportunity outside the law. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano didn't just survive America. He reshaped it from the shadows. Lucky Luciano didn't arrive in America chasing dreams. He arrived chasing survival. In 1906, a 9-year-old boy stepped off a ship from Sicily into New York City. He didn't speak English. He didn't understand the rules, and no one was waiting to help him. His family settled in the Lower East Side, a maze of overcrowded tenements, hunger, and violence. For most immigrants, this was the end of the road, a lifetime of factory work. Poverty passed down like inheritance. But Luciano was different. He learned quickly that school offered no protection. The streets did. By his early teens, he had dropped out of class and enrolled in a harsher education, one where lessons were taught with fists and knives. He ran errands for local gangs, watched deals happen, watched men rise and disappear. And while other boys chased quick money, Luciano watched patterns. Who controlled territory? Who enforced rules? Who survived? By the age of 14, he was already running protection rackets, charging other kids to keep them safe. Not with chaos, with structure. Pay on time, follow the rules, no exceptions. Even then, Luciano wasn't just violent. He was organized. And then came a partnership that changed everything. He befriended Meyer Lansky, a Jewish immigrant just as sharp, just as hungry. At a time when gangs were divided by ethnicity and tradition, Luciano made a decision that shocked everyone. He didn't care where you came from, only whether you were useful. Together, they proved something revolutionary. Crime didn't need bloodlines, it needed intelligence. When Prohibition hit America, the streets exploded with opportunity. Alcohol was illegal, demand skyrocketed. Fortunes were waiting to be claimed. Old bosses saw turf. Luciano saw infrastructure. He built supply chains, distribution networks, protection systems, drivers, smugglers, enforcers. Everyone had a role. Everyone answered to the system. By his mid-20s, Luciano wasn't just wealthy, he was essential. And that made him dangerous to the men who ruled before him. The old mafia bosses believed in tradition, blood feuds, endless revenge. Luciano believed in efficiency. He knew that violence attracted attention. Attention attracted law enforcement, and law enforcement destroyed profits. As long as the old guard remained in power, his vision would never exist. So he did what reformers always do. He removed them. What followed was the bloodiest power struggle the American mafia had ever seen, and Lucky Luciano was standing at the center of it. By the late 1920s, the Mafia was at war with itself. Two powerful factions fought for control of New York. Old traditions, old grudges, old men clinging to power. This conflict would later be called the Castellamarese War. On one side stood the old Sicilian bosses, men who believed loyalty was inherited and violence was the answer to everything. On the other side stood Lucky Luciano. Officially, he was just a lieutenant. Unofficially, he was already thinking like a ruler. Luciano watched the streets fill with bodies, businesses disrupted, profits lost. He understood something the others refused to accept. This war was bad for business. Every killing brought police attention. Every feud weakened the entire organization. So Luciano made a choice that would change the Mafia forever. He stopped choosing sides. Instead, he chose outcomes. The man he answered to, Joe Masseria, ruled through fear, paranoia, and ego. Luciano saw him not as a boss, but as an obstacle. In April of 1931, Luciano set the trap. He invited Masseria to lunch. Cards were dealt. Wine was poured. Then Luciano excused himself. Moments later, gunmen entered the room. When the shooting stopped, the old order was dead. But Luciano wasn't finished. Another boss quickly stepped forward, declaring himself the new boss of bosses. History was repeating itself. Luciano recognized the pattern immediately. One man at the top always led to war, so he struck again. This time, he didn't just remove a rival, he removed the idea entirely. When the dust settled, Luciano did something no gangster had ever done. He refused absolute power. Instead of crowning himself king, he dismantled the throne. He gathered leaders from across the country and proposed something radical: a governing body, equal families, rules to settle disputes without bloodshed. This became the Commission. No more personal vendettas, no more reckless killings, no more wars that threatened profits. Violence would be controlled, territory would be respected, money would flow upward, quietly. In one move, Lucky Luciano transformed the Mafia from a street gang culture into a national criminal syndicate. The killings stopped. The money multiplied. By the age of 34, Luciano had done the unthinkable. He didn't just win the war. He made future wars unnecessary. And for the first time in American history, organized crime became organized. But building an empire always creates enemies. And soon, one man inside the government set his sights on bringing Lucky Luciano down. With the old bosses gone, Lucky Luciano didn't rule through fear. He ruled through design. While other gang leaders demanded loyalty, Luciano demanded efficiency. Every family had territory. Every operation had a purpose. Every dispute had a process. No unnecessary violence, no emotional decisions, only profit. Luciano treated the Mafia the way powerful men treated corporations: gambling, labor unions, bootlegging, loan sharking. Each racket was a division. Each boss was a manager. And the Commission, that was the board of directors. At the center of it all stood Luciano, not as a king, but as the architect. His closest ally, Meyer Lansky, handled the money. Lansky understood finance, laundering profits through banks, casinos, and shell businesses. Together, they looked west. Las Vegas was nothing but desert. Luciano saw the future: casinos, tourism, legal fronts masking illegal money. Decades before anyone else, they turned gambling into an empire. Luciano lived like royalty: luxury hotels, tailored suits, access to politicians and judges. But he rarely raised his voice, rarely gave direct orders. Real power, he believed, operated quietly. And it worked. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano controlled the most powerful criminal network America had ever seen. But no empire grows forever. Because the higher you rise, the more visible you become. And one man was watching closely. His name was Thomas E. Dewey. Young, ambitious, and determined to make a name for himself. Dewey didn't try to prove Luciano ordered murders. That was impossible. Instead, he attacked the empire from underneath, through prostitution rings, paper trails, Witnesses no one thought mattered. Slowly, methodically, the walls began to close in. And in 1936, after years of untouchable power, Lucky Luciano was arrested. The architect of the Mafia was finally in chains. But the system he built, it didn't collapse. It adapted. Because Luciano had designed it to survive without him. And that's when the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because even from a prison cell, Lucky Luciano would prove that his reach extended farther than anyone imagined. The arrest shocked the underworld. Lucky Luciano, the man who rewrote organized crime, was finally in custody. But the government faced a problem. They knew he was the most powerful crime boss in America. Everyone knew it. Proving it was another matter. Luciano was careful. He rarely spoke on phones. He wrote nothing down. He insulated himself with layers of loyal men. There were no orders on paper, no direct witnesses to murder. So the prosecution changed tactics. Leading the charge was Thomas E. Dewey, young, relentless, and ambitious. Dewey didn't try to prove Luciano was a killer. He went after something else: prostitution. It was the one part of the empire that left trails: money, witnesses, fear. Dozens of women testified. So did madams and pimps. Together they painted a picture of a massive operation stretching across New York. Luciano appeared in court every day, tailored suits, calm expression, unshaken. Outside, crowds gathered. Inside, the tension grew. This wasn't just a trial, it was a public reckoning. After only a few hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Guilty. 62 counts. The sentence was devastating. 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man who lived like a king, it was a life sentence. Luciano was sent to one of New York's harshest prisons. Cold, isolated, unforgiving. The world assumed it was over, that the empire would collapse without its architect. They were wrong, because Luciano had never ruled through presence. He ruled through structure. From behind bars, his system continued to operate. Orders flowed outward. Money flowed back. And while the government believed they had buried Lucky Luciano, history was quietly preparing its greatest irony. Because soon, America itself would come knocking on his cell door, asking for help. Prison was supposed to end Lucky Luciano. Instead, it proved how powerful he really was. Locked behind steel bars, cut off from the streets, he should have faded into irrelevance. But the system he built didn't depend on him being free. It depended on him being smart. Through trusted intermediaries, profits continued to move. Orders continued to travel. Disputes were still resolved. The Mafia functioned exactly as designed. Then, history intervened. In 1941, America entered World War II. And suddenly, the nation faced a problem it couldn't solve alone. The New York waterfront, the lifeline for troops, weapons, and supplies heading to Europe, was under threat. The docks were vulnerable to sabotage. German spies were feared. Unions controlled by organized crime dominated the ports, and no one controlled those unions more effectively than Lucky Luciano. Inside government offices, an unthinkable idea began to circulate. What if they approached him? The same man they had locked away might be the only one capable of securing the waterfront. Eventually, pragmatism won. Representatives from U.S. Naval Intelligence paid Luciano a visit in prison. The proposal was simple: help protect the docks, help prevent sabotage. In return, there might be consideration after the war. What exactly Luciano did remains partially classified to this day. But the results were undeniable. Sabotage stopped. The docks stayed operational. Supplies flowed uninterrupted. America never publicly acknowledged the deal, but it honored it. After the war ended, the impossible happened. The same prosecutor who had put Luciano behind bars was now governor of New York, and reluctantly the sentence was commuted. There was a condition: Luciano would be freed, but deported. He would never return to the United States. In 1946, after nearly a decade in prison, Lucky Luciano walked out a free man, not back into New York, but into exile. As the skyline of America faded behind him, Luciano lost the country he had conquered, but not the power he had created. Because distance, to a man like Lucky Luciano, was just another problem to be solved. Freedom came with a price. Lucky Luciano was free, but banished. In 1946, he was deported to Italy, a country he barely recognized anymore. America was gone. New York was gone. The streets he ruled were an ocean away. For most men, exile would have meant the end. For Luciano, it meant adaptation. Italy offered status, but not opportunity. The real power was still across the Atlantic, so Luciano moved again, this time to Cuba. Havana was close enough to America to feel its pulse, and far enough to stay out of reach. From luxury hotels, Luciano held court. American mob bosses traveled to see him. Old alliances were renewed. New strategies were set. Nothing happened without his blessing. In 1946, he organized what was essentially a criminal summit, a gathering of the most powerful mafia figures in the world. There, Luciano reasserted control. Las Vegas expansion was approved. Disputes were settled. Drug trafficking, once taboo, was discussed as business. The empire evolved, but visibility has consequences. The United States noticed. Pressure was applied. Diplomacy turned hostile. Cuba was forced to act. Luciano was expelled again, this time permanently. Back in Italy, his influence slowly began to fade. Not because his ideas failed, but because power, in that world, belongs to those who are present. New leaders rose. New ambitions took shape. Luciano was no longer the commander. He was the architect, respected, remembered, but distant. Yet even in decline, his system held. The commission remained. The families endured. The blueprint survived its creator. And then, after decades of outliving enemies, prisons, and wars, Lucky Luciano met his end in the most unexpected way possible. Not with bullets, not with betrayal, but quietly. Lucky Luciano survived everything that was supposed to kill him. Street wars, betrayals, prison, exile. But in 1962, fate chose a quieter ending. Inside an airport in Naples, as he prepared to meet a film producer to discuss the story of his life, Lucky Luciano collapsed. No gunfire, no revenge. A heart attack ended the life of the man who had reshaped organized crime forever. He was 64 years old. Thousands attended his funeral. Gangsters came from across the world, not to mourn a friend, but to honor a legacy. Luciano was buried far from the streets that made him powerful, but his influence never left them. Because Lucky Luciano didn't build a gang, he built a system. The 5 families still exist. The commission model influenced criminal organizations worldwide. Las Vegas, once desert, became a global empire built on his vision. Even modern criminal networks, from Europe to Latin America, still follow the blueprint he created. Before Luciano, gangsters were thugs. After Luciano, they were businessmen with guns. That is his paradox. He was brilliant, visionary, and devastating. He proved what happens when intelligence finds opportunity outside the law. Lucky Luciano didn't just live the American dream. He hacked it, broke it, and reshaped it into something darker, but undeniably powerful. History remembers presidents and generals, but some of the most lasting changes were made in the shadows by men like Lucky Luciano. Men who never ruled nations, yet changed how power itself works. And that is how Lucky Luciano built the most ruthless mafia empire in history. Lucky Luciano is gone, but the world he helped create never truly disappeared. His system survived governments, wars, and generations of law enforcement. Because power doesn't vanish, it evolves. And history isn't shaped only by heroes. Sometimes it's shaped by men in the shadows who understand systems better than everyone else. This was not a story meant to glorify crime. It was a story meant to understand power, how it's built, how it's protected, and how it outlives the people who create it. If you found this story powerful, thought-provoking, or unsettling, like this video. If you want more deep cinematic stories about the people who shaped history from the shadows, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, do you think Lucky Luciano was simply a criminal or one of the most influential architects of modern power? History listens when you speak.